that he was a part of, how he was struggling to connect with people because he was this product and that most people he met just wanted a piece of him. And so that was something else that I could see underneath the lyrics of the songs. And for me, I was never listening up here on the superficial level. I was always listening to the underneath, who David, hoped that people would get to know, and who the thing that he ultimately came to be and represent beyond the image. I guess that's it. That voice, that hair, and those eyes, you can't argue with it. To me, there's a really interesting, bear with me for a moment, I hope I can communicate it accurately. Yeah. There's a really interesting feminist analysis about how David Cassidy was perceived, received, and marketed, where he was slightly androgynous looking, he was a feminized figure, he's a slight man with long hair, even, the styles in the 70s that weren't just unique to David, but to, the culture more widely. There was kind of more gender fluidity among clothing at the time. And so he had kind of that presentation, which then made it easy to dismiss him as somebody who was, fluffy, not very substantial. And I don't think that was just a commentary on David himself. I think that was a commentary on women, or about femininity, or about things that are perceived as inherently female. His career has been trivialized because, and we know, again, as fans, that there was a very large male fan base, but if you're reading articles about him at the time in the 70s, I mean, they really are talking about the teeny bopper girl fans. And how dismissive of both his talent and his fans to suggest that because the type of talent that he possesses, the types of songs that he's singing, the way that he looks, because that seemed to appeal more to women, it's less than. Why? Even if he hadn't had one male fan, and we know that wasn't true, even if he hadn't, why would it be the case that 50% of the world's population, that their interests and their likes and the things that they gravitate towards are lesser than? So I think it's a negative commentary on people who present more feminine or soft or sensitive. I think it's a negative commentary on female fans. I think it's a negative commentary on youth fans and youth culture as well. That there was, because of the baby boom generation, because they were the largest generation, I think there were efforts to constantly undermine the things that they enjoyed, the things that they partook in, and the idols that they lifted up, because I think the generation that came before realized that they were losing their power, and that they were lesser in numbers, and that one day this generation was going to take over the world. And if they gave credit to that generation's sensibilities and said, oh yeah, this is legitimate music or art or performance, that maybe that generation would have recognized their power. So by constantly dismissing these young people and the things that they like, by constantly dismissing young women and the things that they liked, I think it kept a lot of people in their place. And even from, I think with David, his cultural significance, unfortunately, and it's so sad, and I hate that this is the truth for him, happens to be a little bit of that cautionary tale too, that he was treated like a product, and that when you're treated like a product, what that ultimately does for your self-esteem and for your identity. And ironically, isn't it interesting that David was kind of packaged and manufactured to appeal to female fans, but I imagine that he experienced a lot of things that we as women do experience, which is being judged on the surface, being judged for your appearance, being judged for your sexuality. Turn on the charm, smile, don't complain, don't say anything critical, don't produce anything that destabilizes the status quo. So there is that identification, I think, between, in some ways, David and his fans, of who the experiences his fans had and who they were, and the experience of who David was made out to be. So I think that's kind of one of the more interesting stories about who David Cassidy as a symbol and as an icon was. The majority of the Partridge Family canon, I don't think represents lyrically or sonically who he was, because for the most part, he was just singing the words of others. But vocally, I think that you can hear that. I think that that was perhaps an outlet for him. And I mean, we can psychoanalyze all the live long day, but I think that's what makes his voice and his work stand the test of time, even though it was written for a younger audience, even though some critics have dismissed it as quote unquote bubblegum music, is you can hear that he was kind of, for lack of a better term, making lemons out of lemonade. These weren't necessarily the songs that he wanted to be singing. This wasn't necessarily the career that he wanted to be having, but my God, did he pour heart and soul into every vocal that he recorded. And you can almost feel that strain and that pressure emanating vocally from him, of trying to break free from that box, and almost, like I said, communicating a subtext under some of those fluffier lyrics. But then certainly when you get into his solo work, I mean, there's no doubt that he's trying to communicate those things. And I think, I was reflecting on some of my favorite albums, and probably two of my favorite David Cassidy albums are The Higher They Climb and Home Is Where the Heart Is, which had no impact here stateside. I'm from Canada, but pretty much his career in Canada and the United States ran parallel. So I don't think that the average, casual fan in Canada would even be aware of these albums. But you see how many of the songs were written by him. And I think, especially when you're looking at, with the Higher They Climb album, it's really interesting because he's influenced by, you can get kind of a little bit of the funky disco elements sonically that are coming in, which is just a piece of the time. But you also get, he does like a throwback with Bebop Alula, where he's kind of getting into that bluesy tradition of things that he would have maybe grown up with, and almost paying that reverence and respect to the early days of rock and teen idoldom, which would, later help to spell out his career. But then you also hear, I think this is when his voice starts to get a little bit of that gravel and that grit in it, where he's moving into the kind of the blues tradition. I mean, he's always cited the blues and B.B. King among some of his greatest influences. So you can see not only lyrically some of the themes of, loneliness and identity crises and maybe self-discovery that he's singing about, and he's now free to sing about post-Partridge Family, but even just the style of music that he's communicating in. I think maybe these albums weren't as well received because, one, they were unexpected. They didn't necessarily reflect the type of style that had made him initially popular. So if fans were wanting more of the same, they weren't getting it. I don't know if it's being a David Cassidy fan or if it's, again, having that benefit of hindsight and being a historian, because to me, as a record of who David was as an artist and a person, those two albums make perfect sense because of the things that they communicate, because of his past influences and who he was trying to grow into. Because when you listen to David's recording of I Write the Songs, there was no other way to interpret and perform that song than the way that David did it. In terms of meaning and depth and poignancy, I Write the Songs in Barry Manilow's hands means next to nothing. I Write the Songs in David's hands is really poignant, clear snapshot of an experience, that we know David had as a recording artist. Obviously it's sanctioned, it's not plagiarism, but you could almost imagine that David could have felt that way, right? Like, you make kind of this beautiful song, this, for all intents and purposes, masterpiece, and then somebody else goes and does the exact same thing and somehow gets the recognition for it. It's not literal plagiarism. There's no theft. Obviously, the recording rights and publishing rights were all on the up and up, but I would have felt that way. What I also really admire about it, though, is that I think David's unique way artistically of communicating pain is to, there's definitely a catharsis there. There's a respect for it. And there's a way of not, I don't think that he's not aggressive about expressing it, right? You don't hear, which, maybe he has every right for some of the ways that he was taken advantage of in his career, but you don't hear bitterness. You don't hear resentment. You maybe hear a little bit of regret and sorrow and longing. You hear those kinds of things, but I think that's what also makes it palatable and endure the test of time, because you don't get the sense, here's a man who was sort of handed the world on a silver platter, unwittingly. That wasn't the goal that he had for his career. And then it was taken from him, and in a really unceremonious fashion, in a sense, he was abandoned and left to his own devices by the industry and fans at this kind of mid-70s point. Again, I'm speaking more North America. I'm trying to find myself. He could have told his own story in a very different way, and I don't think he ever communicated that through his art, like I said, in that sort of bitter, resentful, angsty, hard edge way. I think he was still trying to communicate a love letter to the opportunities that he had been given, while also proving himself in a new way. And what a sort of beautiful, honorable, respectful way to communicate those struggles.